Peter Hartcher and Paul Kelly. I should talk a lot less in the next few minutes and let them explain what's happened. Paul, to you first of all. Basically, Scott Morrison saying this is just Labor trying this on. Labor's retort to that was there is a strike force that's been formed. What do you think of what's happened today?
Well, what the Prime Minister said was that the New South Wales Police were looking into this because the shadow attorney had asked them to. Morrison was quizzed about this at question time. Labor's been running on this for a long period of time. They think they can do a lot of damage to Angus Taylor. They think they may be able to claim his scalp. Well, Scott Morrison undermined that today, made it absolutely clear that at this stage anyway, he sees no grounds whatsoever to move against Angus Taylor, to stand down Angus Taylor.
Can we learn anything from history in terms of the strike force being formed, Peter, or is that a bit of a leap?
No, I think we can learn from history, though, that what Scott Morrison is doing now is the conventional practice ever since the early Howard years of when he had to when he was taking ministerial responsibility very seriously and had to line up a few of his ministers in rapid fire at the firing squad, and that cost him internally, it cost him party support, it created dissent in the ranks, and Scott Morrison and every Prime Minister since has learned from that and will stand by their ministers to the last gasp. Labor will go through the motions, but they're not too upset because they think they've got Angus Taylor in their sights. They think the longer he's there, the more fun they can have tormenting him. So, you know, it's win-win.
I mean, we had no information today apart from the strike force. The situation still is that Angus Taylor says someone in his office got this information from the City Council website. The Council has said, here's all of our metadata. I must admit I should be better at that stuff, but I'm not entirely qualified to comb through it all. But we haven't had the metadata presented from Angus Taylor's side, and that's what Labor's saying is missing here.
Well, it's a mystery. I mean, we don't know what happened. I mean, there's no proper explanation as to what actually happened here. Whether or not we ever get a full explanation, I'm not certain. We can expect the campaign against Angus Taylor to continue. He's in a critical portfolio, the energy and emissions reduction portfolio, so he's under pressure there as well. But having said that, I think Scott Morrison has pretty well indicated today that he's going to be defending Angus Taylor strongly. So unless Labor can produce some new evidence, then I don't think this has got anywhere to go, really.
Or something happens, I suppose, with the police investigation. We will see what does happen with that. As I said, they're voting now. We'll just show you pictures of the House Division required. This is once again, though, Michael Sukkar, the Minister there, moving that Anthony Albanese no longer be heard as he tries to suspend standing orders, and they go through the motions. Let's get on to still substantial things, though. I did want to certainly talk about China with both of you, particularly you, Peter Hartcher, with your quarterly essay, which is getting a little bit of attention at the moment. You had Kevin Rudd there along as well to launch it. Now, he says foreign interference laws are the right approach, but interestingly as well warned of going too far, even mentioning the yellow peril today. What did you make of that?
Well, look, the fundamental point that I think he was trying to make, and I think probably we should remind ourselves of, is that while our system is under sustained assault by an authoritarian political project called the Chinese Communist Party, we do not have any beef with the Chinese people themselves. And that was the point Rudd was making. I'd certainly agree with that. And I think any sound-minded person in the national interest would make the same point. Where Rudd went a little further, though, was to say that Australia needed to bulk up in every sense, both its defence assets, but also its population. And he nominated that Australia should head for a population of 50 million people, which he nominated as the minimum credible number to support the proper funding of a required military and intelligence apparatus. And he presented his Big Australia vision with a view towards, in his own language, Australia having to confront China without the US being, or any major ally being there between us and China by the middle of the century. Is that sort of realistic in that confront, or is that, so 50 million is at a level where we need to be, at least to be able to play defence, essentially? That's his argument. Now, I haven't got an actuary to look through the details of those assumptions. I don't know, but that's what the point that Rudd was making today.
Are we ready for another big Australia conversation, do you think, Paul?
I don't think so. I mean, the population has increased pretty significantly over the course of the past decade since Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister. And I think people are alert to the great danger of advertising and promoting the idea of a big Australia. I mean, essentially, we can get there, provided we don't talk about it all that much, provided we have ongoing and strong economic growth, which will underpin a strong immigration program. I think it's very interesting to look at what Scott Morrison did, because he was under very strong pressure from the populist right when he became Prime Minister to make a very significant cut to the immigration program, and he didn't. He made a modest cut, only a modest cut. And I think that's a very, very telling sign. So I think that there's broad support from both sides of politics for a healthy and robust immigration program.
Yeah, the tweak that you mentioned that sort of brought things in line to what was happening anyway, so a pretty measured reaction. I'm interested on the topic of China because we've had this spy or intelligence officer, depending how you'd classify them, the leak as well on the strategy for the Uyghur minority that's come out recently. Is there a chance the Xi purges and the leader for life title he gave himself as well could actually be backfiring? Some want an escape plan, defecting might look more appealing, leaking secrets might undermine him, that this attempt to strengthen has done the opposite?
Yes, and in fact, people were quite curious to get Kevin Rudd's take on this, that being his area of expertise, the state of internal dissent within the Chinese Communist Party. I should add, by the way, lest this start to look like a partisan thing where I've got Kevin Rudd launching my quarterly essay. Julie Bishop is doing the Sydney launch in 2 days' time. Very good. So just wanted to get
her thoughts will be interesting as well.
Well, she hasn't done anything serious or substantive since leaving politics, so it could be.
We'll get a camera there.
It's the risk. It could be interesting. But Kevin Rudd did make the point that Xi Jinping had ruffled feathers with his anti-corruption crackdown within the Chinese Communist Party. That there is his biggest, in his words, Xi Jinping's biggest problem is the economic slowdown, and there is of course also the trade war that China and the US have underway. So the Hong Kong problem, the Uyghur problem, these are all blowing up in Xi Jinping's face. This is not healthy for him in his domestic political setup. Kevin Rudd didn't then join the dots to say this was going to produce a substantive resistance to Xi Jinping, but he did acknowledge that it was all creating some domestic political resistance, and he also made the point that in the ranks of officialdom, Chinese government officialdom, there was dissent about Xi Jinping's go slow on economic reform.
Right. The short-term issue, Paul, or do you think it is one, I suppose, with Gladys Liu? She had the self-audit to do with any groups, links she had with the United Front. We know, or we believe now, Chisholm was a target with a separate person, but does this increase the pressure to really find out what's happening? And perhaps with Jennifer Yang as well, the Taiwan candidate that had these loose links as well, the Labor candidate, that we need to know what happened here. Well,
I think we do, and I think the pressure will increase because what we're now seeing and what is increasingly documented, and it's been the concern of the security agencies, is a Chinese penetration of this country, cyber warfare against this country, penetration of institutions, and now claims that China was attempting to recruit people for the parliament. So we're not at war with China, but we now face a long struggle with China. And we are becoming more and more acquainted with the nature of China's tactics. These are tactics that we've never encountered before as a country in terms of China's power, its foreign penetration, its effort to influence political outcomes in this country.
And shameless effort.
Well, exactly. So what is required, I think, is a robust, measured, but very resolute Australian response across the board, which will take a number of different manifestations. I think we're moving fairly clearly in that direction.
Fascinating to see the reaction in Hong Kong with these elections. A clear rejection of Beijing there. Are you almost surprised they allowed the elections to happen in one sense?
Well, there are signs that Beijing thought this would actually go their way, that Carrie Lam would carry the day.
Some of the violent incidents we saw, for example, portrayed, and they thought things were shifting back.
Yeah, so Beijing has portrayed this as a bunch of local terrorists and thugs and rioters backed by sinister Western forces that were stirring up trouble and would not be supported by the majority of Hong Kong people who just want stability. That narrative, the Beijing narrative, was thoroughly repudiated in this election result, but it persists. And you see it today in Carrie Lam's remarks. She's said in result, the chief executive of Hong Kong, that these results reflect that the people were impatient with her for failing to quell the violence rather than taking it as a gesture of support for the protesters. So that tells you that the Beijing narrative, they're going to stick with their narrative, even in the face of a 55% share of the popular vote in favour of the democracy candidates, who in turn, because they've got a first-past-the-post system in that election setup, got them 86% of the seats, local council seats so far declared. Not
to mention the limiting factor of who can vote over there.
Yeah, that's right. And so this is blown up for Xi Jinping, and this is getting very uncomfortable for him domestically. So and your point about the Uyghurs, world opinion has turned in the last year very firmly, decisively against him. Now, only in the democratic world, we see 35 Chinese client states signing letters in support of the Xinjiang prison camps and the mass detention. But in the democratic world, the alarm has gone out, and it's gone out here as well. And these stories, which my colleague Nick McKenzie and his team have been breaking for the company formerly known as Fairfax, now Nine, in this last week, are a further sign to Australia that, as Paul says, we need to really step up the defence of our internal democratic and social systems.